Hey guys, today's lecture discussion is on politics and economics of the Gilded Age. And we've talked a little bit about the Gilded Age, and we understand some basic concepts about that. And we also know, of course, this is the era of laissez-faire. So the government is very hands-off of the economy. But I thought what we would do is talk a little bit about politics during the time period, and then talk a little bit about how those politics transforms the economic conditions of the country. The first thing I think is important to understand when it comes to politics is that the presidents of this time period are oftentimes nicknamed the forgotten presidents. And part of that is because the presidents of this era are not really known for being incredibly strong or for enforcing their will upon the people. Instead, it seems that the external issues, like the economy, like business, like some of the social conditions, such as immigration and so forth, tends to trump the time period. So we don't learn as much about these presidents. If you think about it, it's kind of like when we study the 1840s. We don't really remember a lot of the presidents of that time period. We remember the conditions of the time period. Again, immigration or expansion out west, pre-Civil War things. So you see a bit of that during this era of the Gilded Age, hence the forgettable presidents. Not many of them are known for being outstanding by any means. Most were of one political party. Most are the Republican, with one notable example, which is Grover Cleveland, who is a Democrat. Ultimately, though, what you see is a stronghold of the Republican Party in the presidency, and Congress is kind of split. But what I want to do is kind of, for a moment, talk about politics, not just nationally, but also locally in communities, not the federal government. And politics at this time period is based on the concept of patronage. And patronage is all about who you know. Meaning, it's a process of rewarding, or awarding, either way, your political supporters with a political job. So, for example, if I were running to be governor of Washington State, not that that's a job I want, but if I was running to be governor of Washington State, and you were campaigning for me, maybe you were my campaign manager, if I get elected and I'm successful at meeting my goal, then I might decide to appoint you to be Secretary of Transportation for the state of Washington, which is a very important job considering all the bridges and the interstates and the highways and the ferries that we have here in our great state. Now, are you qualified to be Secretary of Transportation for the state of Washington? Well, perhaps not. But that doesn't matter, because under a system of patronage, I appoint you because you helped me get into a position, not necessarily because you're qualified for that position. And patronage was something that had taken place within communities, within states, and within the federal government. There's also another term I want to introduce you to, and that's called a political machine. No, a political machine is not an actual machine, so don't get that confused. Nobody's creating something. It's not a piece of technology or anything along those lines. Instead, it's the name we give to a political organization whose goal it is to get someone elected. So, oftentimes, there were political machines within states and within communities. So, for example, there would be a Republican political machine in New York City and a Democratic political machine in New York City. And oftentimes, these political machines had somebody in charge, and they were called the boss. So, in charge of the political machine might be Boss So-and-so, or Boss Condit, or Boss Fitzgerald, or whatever your last name would be. But you would be the one whose job it was to organize the machine with trying to get someone elected. Now, if I'm the boss, I'm actually not up for election. Maybe I'm trying to get someone to be elected as governor of Washington. And so the boss works and organizes the organization to get that person elected into the position. And then likewise, I might end up with a patronage job as a result. So this is quite common. And oftentimes, under patronage and under political machines, you see a great deal of corruption, which is sort of my key point here. Is that politics in the Gilded Age were very much corrupted. And again, there's very few government regulations occurring. And what's going to prevent the corruption? The politicians are the ones who make the regulations. So this is quite common to see that level of corruption in government, and nobody is really kind of preventing it. So there's a great deal of fraud at the time period, including election fraud. So it's hard to guarantee that people got elected purely because there was a true vote for them, but rather those votes could have been easily manipulated. The Republican machine in the 1870s and 1880s was actually divided. And in 1876, it was divided into two groups, or factions. And faction is just another word for a group. The first group was called the Stalwarts. And they, the leader of their faction is a man by the name of Roscoe Conkling. And the second group is called the Half-Breeds. And their leader is James Blaine. And the Republican Party had a great deal of struggle in trying to organize itself, right? It had bounced back after the Civil War. It had become quite strong, but there was division within the party. And the division, of course, were the Stalwarts and these half-breeds. And they both wanted control, and they both wanted power. And eventually, what ends up happening is that members of the Republican Party end up leaving. They pick up and they leave, and they some of them actually throw their support behind the Democratic Party. And those that throw their name behind, or their support behind the Democratic Party, become nicknamed the Mugwumps. So if it's not confusing enough for there to be stalwarts and half-breeds, now we add in the Mugwumps. So what does that tell us? It tells us that despite the fact that politics are incredibly corrupt and that there's struggles within them, that there are members of these political groups that are vying for control and for power, and some of them end up leaving and defecting to join another political party. So there's a little uncertainty within politics at the time period. So I want to transition a little bit and move away from some of those political factors to talk a bit about economics in the time period in business and industry. And I'll start by talking about the railroad. The railroad was an industry which had developed, before the Civil War. But most railroads actually before the Civil War were in the North. There were very few in the South. And you might recall, that the railroad industry grew dramatically during the Civil War and afterwards. In fact, there was a plan put in place by Lincoln to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which would be the railroad that connected the entire continent together. It was a huge task and a project that was federally funded, so funded by the federal government. They became involved in this massive building project. And yet, despite the fact that there were large businesses that were being paid by the federal government to create the railroads, these railroads would oftentimes charge more than what the actual rate of construction was for building the railroad. So imagine if I contract with you to build my house, and you tell me, it's going to cost you about, $250,000 to build this house, and then you turn around and charge me $750,000. You're the one who's making this huge profit, and I'm the one who now has to pay. So the federal government did this, and these builders of the railroad, and railroad companies were the Union Pacific or the Central Pacific, but companies who built these railroads would indeed overcharge the federal government. And later on, when this overcharge is found, this fraudulent charge, the railroads oftentimes paid off members of Congress to stop investigating them. This is called the Credit Mobilier scandal. So you see members of the railroad paying off members of Congress to kind of leave them alone. They oftentimes would pay their rates, so they would just kind of give them a free pass to get on the railroad, or if they had a business or a corporation that they were involved in, that member of Congress then kind of had that free pass. They could get their cattle loaded on the railroad for no additional charge. So it's an example of some of the corruption that existed in the railroad. Likewise, the railroad, when it built its railroad tracks across the United States, didn't really care if they were building through property that was yours. In 1862, Congress authorized the Homestead Act, and that's something we'll be talking a little bit more about later on in this unit. But the Homestead Act allowed you to go and settle on a piece of land out west. You filed a claim, and that land was yours if you lived on it for upwards of 5 years and improved the land in some way, shape, or form. But if the railroad had permission to build, then they would just build right through your land, and it might be unfortunate that your land is divided in two because the railroad built through it. And sadly, there were a lot of American farmers and ranchers that faced great consequences because the railroad built through their land. So this is just an example of a bit of the corruption that existed. There was corruption in other industries too. So, for example, in the gold industry, the United States, at that point in time, had all of our money backed by gold. So if we issued $1, then there would have to be $1 worth of gold available in the U.S. Treasury. But gold supply became slim, and some individuals in government, a guy by the name of J. Fisk and Jay Gould, ended up buying gold off the market, which caused the U.S. economy to crash, and the U.S. actually ran out of gold, which meant our money was weak, right? Because we don't have that gold to back up our dollars, so we can't print more dollars. And again, you see corruption in business and in industry. Yet another result of what happens when you have a laissez-faire government. And that's not to say that, having no regulations can have its benefits. It absolutely has its benefits. You just have to determine whether those benefits outweigh the consequence or the risk involved. And I think if we look at the Gilded Age as a whole, there are individuals that are profiting, that are doing quite well, and that they provided massive services to this country. Things that created great change here in the United States. Good change, things that were necessary. But on the other side, there's a large population that suffers because of lack of regulation in the marketplace. So let me give you an example. An example of that might be the oil industry. So the oil industry in this country was created essentially by a man by the name of John Rockefeller, and maybe you've heard of him before. Maybe you've heard of Rockefeller Center. But John Rockefeller got involved in the oil industry very early on. He is definitely an entrepreneur, and it's hard to fault him for his foresight and his vision of what the oil industry would turn into be. What he does is he essentially creates a monopoly. And the way that he creates a monopoly is by buying out other oil businesses that are similar to his Standard Oil. And when you buy out your competitors, that's called horizontal consolidation. I'll say that again for you. Horizontal consolidation. It's when you buy out your competitors. By doing that, he essentially created a monopoly on the market because he can buy out his competitors and then there's no one else to compete with him. So what can he do to the price of that, right? He can raise the price if he wants to. And again, there's no government involvement in this process. There's no regulation about monopolies. There's no required competition that exists. Now, you could argue, is that Rockefeller's fault that there's no competition, that he happens to be creating a better product? No, it's not his fault. It's the consequence. On the flip side, you can also argue that it's healthier for the American consumers if there's competition in the marketplace because it helps drive prices lower. So it just depends on which side of the argument you fall. But realize, as I keep coming back to, this is what we see in the Gilded Age. We see some people benefit, but others lose. And maybe it's not so different from what we see today. Because in essence, that's the nature of business and industry. Some people benefit and other people lose. So the Gilded Age is this time period in American history where there's great growth, significant growth of the economy. And as I told you, the cities are growing. But there's also these consequences to it. And it really is this time period when we start to become more modernized as a nation. And the things that we see in our economy today and in our business and industry come from or evolve from this early time period of industrialization. So please let me know what questions you have. I'd be happy to answer them. And I hope that you've watched this prior to Wednesday. And I'll see you in class. Have a great day. Bye.